If a woman insists every breakup term must favor her, but your lawyer already filed evidence that makes her claims impossible, do you argue back, or do you walk out, let the minutes speak, and watch her realize she's fighting air? My name is Ethan Hale, and the strange thing about betrayal is how ordinary it tries to look when it walks back into your house and asks for fairness with a straight face. I used to think the worst part would be the moment I caught the lie, the sharp second when your brain finally stops defending someone you love and just accepts that they are capable of deliberate cruelty, but I was wrong. The worst part came later, when she acted like the truth was negotiable, like reality was a contract she could rewrite if she spoke loudly enough, and kept her chin lifted like a queen expecting tribute. Her name was Vanessa, and she had a talent for turning every conversation into a courtroom where she played judge, jury, and headline. She didn't just want to win, she wanted me to feel ridiculous for thinking I deserved anything at all. In our early years together, I mistook that confidence for strength, the way a lot of people do when they want love to feel like safety. Over time, I realized it wasn't strength, it was control, and it was only charming when it wasn't pointed at you. The week everything finally snapped into focus started with a calendar invite, which sounds harmless until you remember that most disasters begin as small, forgettable details. Vanessa told me she was meeting her sister for dinner, one of those casual family plans that never raised questions because I had trained myself not to ask any. But the invite that popped up on our shared tablet didn't say dinner with her sister. It said vendor walkthrough, with a location pinned to a downtown hotel and a time block that swallowed the entire evening. She deleted it quickly, the way someone swats a fly and assumes nobody noticed, but the notification had already done its job. It wasn't proof, not yet, but it was a crack in the glass, and once you see the crack, you start looking for the pressure points. I didn't confront her that night, and that decision wasn't noble. It was practical. Confrontation is a gift to someone who feeds on conflict, because conflict gives them a stage and an excuse to rewrite the scene in real time. If I accused her with nothing solid, she would cry, then rage, then accuse me of spying, and by the end of it, I would be the villain who doesn't trust her, and she would be the victim who just needed space. I had watched her do it to friends, to colleagues, even to her own mother. Vanessa didn't lose arguments. She changed the topic until she could win something adjacent and call it victory. So I went quiet and did what I always did when my life started to feel unreal. I built structure around it. I wrote dates down. I saved what I was allowed to save. I compared what she said to what the world said. It wasn't dramatic. It was methodical, like cleaning up broken glass before someone steps on it. People think revenge is about heat, about rage and shouting and smashed plates. But real revenge, the kind that lasts, is cold and procedural. It's death by 1,000 truths, each one small, each one legal, each one undeniable. Vanessa didn't notice the shift at first, because she was too busy enjoying whatever new story she was living. She started coming home with a brightness that didn't belong to us, a sharpened energy that smelled like perfume and secrets. She would toss her keys into the bowl by the door and talk fast about a meeting that ran long, a friend who needed her, a problem she fixed at work, and she would do it with a confidence that would have impressed me months earlier. When she thought she was winning, she was generous with detail. When she was lying, she was vague and annoyed. That pattern became one of my first anchors, a simple little tell that I could spot without even looking up from my plate. The second anchor came from money, because money is honest even when people aren't. We kept separate accounts with a shared card for household expenses, a practical arrangement that worked because I had always been the kind of man who believed in clear lines and clean agreements. One morning, while I was making coffee, a merchant alert hit my phone for a charge on the shared card at a boutique hotel's restaurant. The amount wasn't obscene, but the timestamp was. Vanessa was supposed to be at a training session across town, a professional thing she'd mentioned casually while scrolling her phone, like it wasn't worth remembering. The alert wasn't a full confession, it was a breadcrumb, and I had learned how to follow breadcrumbs without stomping around like an idiot. I screenshotted the alert and labeled it with the date, then I moved on with my day as if nothing had happened. I went to work, sat through meetings, answered emails, spoke in complete sentences, and kept my voice steady while my mind quietly rearranged the furniture of my life. By the time I came home, Vanessa was already there, showered and humming, wearing the kind of soft smile that was never meant for me. She asked how my day was, the way a stranger does when they're being polite, and I answered the way you answer a stranger when you're taking notes. It would be easy to say I felt nothing but anger wasn't the main feeling. The main feeling was clarity, and clarity can be almost peaceful when you finally stop hoping for a different version of someone. I didn't need her to admit anything for me to know the shape of it. I just needed enough documented reality to make sure she couldn't lie her way through the next phase. That phase arrived sooner than I expected, because Vanessa didn't just cheat, she escalated. She started making comments about our future, about what makes sense, about how people change, and she said those things with the casual entitlement of someone already planning an exit. Then she brought up separation like it was a reasonable discussion over dinner, as if she hadn't been quietly ripping the foundation out from under us for months. She said we should be adults, and the way she stressed that word told me she had already decided that I would be the childish one. 2 days after that conversation, she texted me from her car, telling me she was going to spend the weekend with friends, a girl's reset, her words, and she added a little heart emoji like it was seasoning. I watched her pack a small bag, watched her check her phone twice in 5 minutes, watched her glance at the mirror the way someone does before they step into a life they like better. She kissed my cheek without looking at me and said she'd be back Sunday night. I smiled and told her to have fun because I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of a scene. Sunday night she walked in with an engagement ring on her finger. It was not subtle. It was not accidental. It was a small, bright weapon, and she held it up in the kitchen light as if she expected me to applaud her courage. Her face had that composed softness she used when she wanted to look like the reasonable one, the mature one, the woman who had made a hard choice. She said we needed to talk, and she didn't sound scared. She sounded prepared. I looked at the ring, then at her, and something inside me clicked into place so cleanly that I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was perfect in the worst possible way. She hadn't just betrayed me. She had lined the betrayal up like a trophy and brought it home for display. I told her there was no need, and I meant it. What she didn't understand about that sentence was that it wasn't resignation. It was closure. It was me refusing to climb onto her stage. I didn't ask who he was in that moment, because I already had names on paper, times saved, and a small ledger that was getting heavier by the day. I didn't ask why she did it, because people like Vanessa always have reasons, and reasons are just costumes for choices. I didn't beg, because begging is what she expected, and she had built her new story on the assumption that I would behave like the man she could out-talk. Instead, I went to my desk, opened a folder I had been building quietly, and made a call I had been preparing to make. My lawyer's name was Daniel Crow, and he didn't waste words. When I told him Vanessa had come home wearing another man's ring, he didn't react with shock or pity, because Daniel had seen every variation of human selfishness that could fit into a courthouse. He asked if she had moved any money, if she had threatened anything, if there were documents in the home I needed secured. Then he reminded me of the most important rule in situations like mine. Do nothing impulsive that can be framed as abuse or instability. In other words, stay boring. Stay calm. Let the records do the talking. The next morning, while Vanessa was at her parents' house sharing her news, I had her belongings moved out. It was legal. It was documented. I didn't throw her things in the yard like a man trying to prove he had feelings. I hired a local moving company, signed papers, took photos of each room before and after, and stored everything in a unit under my name with a clear inventory list. I changed the locks with the landlord's written approval because the lease was in my name and because I had already spoken to Daniel about how to do it without creating a mess that could be used against me. Vanessa returned that afternoon, furious and theatrical, as if I had committed the betrayal by refusing to host her victory lap. She shouted in the hallway and demanded entry like she owned the building, and when the neighbors cracked their doors open to watch, she only got louder. I didn't match her volume. I stood behind the door and told her calmly where her things were, and I told her my lawyer would contact her attorney about next steps. She screamed that I was being cruel. She screamed that I was unstable. She screamed that I was ruining her life. It was amazing how quickly she switched from triumphant fiancé to wounded victim, and I could almost respect the agility if it hadn't been aimed at my throat. That night, Daniel filed a set of documents that made her next performance pointless. He submitted evidence that didn't rely on emotion or accusation, just timestamps and contradictions, the kind of boring proof that judges love because it doesn't ask them to guess. We included the merchant alerts, the shared calendar conflict, the saved public post that showed her tagged at a place she claimed she'd never been, and a clean timeline that matched her lies to the world's receipts. None of it was illegal. None of it was invasive. It was simply the record of what she did while assuming nobody would write it down. Vanessa still showed up to the first hearing with a list of demands, because entitlement doesn't disappear just because the facts arrive. She wanted favorable terms on everything. She wanted the narrative, she wanted me painted as the problem, and she wanted the court to believe she was the rational one who had moved on while I was reacting. She spoke with that confident, polished fury that used to make people flinch, but the room didn't flinch. The room had papers. I sat beside Daniel and watched her build a castle out of breath, and I knew exactly what would happen the moment the judge looked down at the file. When Vanessa started arguing, she argued like she always did, louder and sharper, as if volume could change the date on a receipt. She insisted on stories that the evidence had already crushed, and every time she doubled down, she dug deeper. Daniel didn't interrupt. He didn't grandstand. He waited, then handed over the exhibits with the quiet patience of a man feeding rope to someone who thinks they're climbing. And when Vanessa finally turned her eyes to me, expecting me to fight back, I did something she had never learned how to handle. I stood up, nodded once to the judge, and walked out. Behind me, I heard her voice still going, still demanding, still rewriting, still swinging at a ghost she couldn't hit, because the room no longer needed my anger to understand what she was. In the hallway, my phone buzzed with a new notification from the shared account, and when I glanced down at the screen, I saw a charge that made my stomach go cold for a different reason. It wasn't just that she had a fiancé. It was that she had been building a second life with my address on it, and the next piece of evidence had just arrived. The notification was for a security deposit, and not the kind you pay when you rent a vacation cabin with friends and pretend you still have a conscience. It was a deposit for an apartment, processed through a property management portal, with my shared card sitting there like a dumb, obedient witness. The amount was specific, the merchant name was formal, and the timestamp was the kind of neat little detail that makes a lie impossible to dress up later. Vanessa had always been careful with her own accounts, always talking about independence when it suited her, but she had no problem using my stability as a launchpad when she needed something quick. I stood in the courthouse hallway with people brushing past me, and it felt like being underwater while everyone else breathed normally. My first instinct was to call her, because that is what a reasonable person does when the floor drops out. They reach for the nearest hand. Then I remembered that Vanessa wasn't a hand. Vanessa was the person who pushed you, then asked why you were falling so dramatically. I took a screenshot of the charge and saved it to the same folder I'd been building since the first crack in the glass. I didn't do it with shaking hands. I did it with the calm muscle memory of a man who had learned that emotions are expensive and documentation is cheap. Then I walked outside, inhaled winter air that tasted like metal and wet concrete, and called Daniel. He answered on the second ring as if he had been waiting for the next shoe to land, and I told him about the deposit, the merchant, the timestamp, and the fact that it hit our shared account while Vanessa was busy auditioning for sainthood in a courtroom. Daniel didn't ask me how I felt, because Daniel wasn't my therapist, and I wasn't paying him to care about my heart. He asked what account it hit, whether it was authorized, and whether there were any other pending charges. Then he told me, in a tone so flat it could have been read by a GPS, that this was helpful. Helpful was a strange word for the moment when you realize someone has been using your life like a hotel room they plan to trash before checkout. But I understood what he meant. The charge wasn't just insulting, it was a breadcrumb with a corporate logo on it. It was proof of intent, proof of planning, proof that Vanessa wasn't reacting to some sudden collapse of romance. She had been preparing a new stage while still collecting the benefits of the old one. I drove home, and the silence in my car felt different now. It wasn't the stunned silence of loss, it was the working silence of a machine being recalibrated. When I got home, I found two things waiting for me: a voicemail from Vanessa's mother and a text from a number I didn't recognize. The voicemail was pure performance. Her mother had always treated family conflict like a public relations emergency, the kind where you smooth everything over and pretend nobody saw the smoke. She told me Vanessa was devastated, that I had embarrassed her, that I was being vindictive, and that we could resolve this like adults if I would stop acting rashly. I listened to the whole thing because I wanted the full flavor of the delusion. Then I saved it. Not because it was evidence of wrongdoing, but because it was evidence of the narrative they were trying to build, and narratives matter when people start throwing accusations around like confetti. The text was shorter and more interesting. It said, "I think we should talk. Please." No name, no context, no signature, just that limp little plea. I stared at it for a minute, then did what any modern adult does when mystery knocks. I Googled the number. It wasn't some anonymous scam. It was attached to a small business listing for a wedding services company, the kind that provides bespoke coordination and luxury vendor relationships, which is a fancy way of saying they charge you extra to stress in a nicer font. The listing had a name: Brent Calder, Senior Planner. So that was the fiancé's name, or at least one of the names orbiting this mess, and he wasn't calling to threaten me or gloat. He was calling like a man who had just realized his shiny new engagement ring might be attached to an active crime scene. I didn't respond right away. I sat at my kitchen table and opened my folder. Then I laid out the pieces on paper like I was building a small, controlled fire. Screenshot of the shared account charge. Screenshot of the calendar conflict. The merchant alert from the hotel restaurant. The public tag I'd saved from her social media, the one she deleted later like deleting a post deletes time. The voicemail from her mother. None of it was dramatic alone. Together, it was a pattern. And patterns are what courts and employers and families understand when they stop pretending not to. I called Daniel back and told him about the text. He asked for the number, then told me not to engage without a plan. He reminded me again that I wasn't just dealing with a breakup. I was dealing with a person who would try to turn every consequence into persecution. The best defense was to stay consistent and let the facts be boring. After I hung up, I finally answered Brent's text with a single sentence that didn't invite negotiation. "You can talk, but not at my home." He replied almost immediately. "Thank you." "Where?" I chose a public place that wasn't romantic and wasn't private. A bank lobby cafe near downtown, the kind of place where people speak softly because there are cameras and money and bored security guards watching. Not because I needed surveillance or drama, but because I wanted the tone to be adult, calm, and painfully real. I sent the location and a time, and Brent confirmed in a way that sounded like relief. That confirmed something else too. Vanessa hadn't told him the full story, because a man who thinks he is winning doesn't sound that nervous. The next morning, before the meeting, a second notification arrived on the shared account. This time, it was an application fee, same property management portal, different amount. Vanessa was running a checklist: deposit, application, likely utilities next. She wasn't just engaged, she was relocating, and she was doing it fast, using my shared card like it was a business expense. I took the screenshot, saved it, and then I made coffee with the careful calm of a man who refuses to spill anything on himself. When I arrived at the bank cafe, Brent was already there, sitting stiffly with a paper cup in his hands as if he didn't trust himself with glass. He was in his 30s, well-dressed, well-groomed, and carrying that slightly haunted look you see on men who believed a story because it was flattering. His eyes went to my hands first, like he expected me to stand up and punch him, which told me Vanessa had likely painted me as unstable. That was fine. Let him think that. The truth doesn't need good lighting. I sat across from him and didn't offer a handshake, because I wasn't here to make friends. Brent introduced himself, then asked my name as if he wasn't sure he had the right person. When I confirmed, he swallowed and said Vanessa told him we had been on and off, that we had separate lives, that I had agreed, it was over months ago. He said it like a man reciting lines he'd been given, careful to sound fair. I listened without interrupting, because interrupting would give him something to cling to. When he finished, I nodded once and asked the simplest question I could think of. How long has she been living with me? Brent blinked, and the pause that followed was the first honest thing he'd offered. He said he didn't know. He said she told him she had moved out already. He said she had been staying with friends while they planned the wedding. He said she didn't want drama, and he laughed weakly at the word, as if he could still make it cute. I reached into my folder and slid a printed page across the table. It was a timeline, one page, clean and neutral, with dates, locations, and the corresponding proof notes listed beside them. I didn't make it theatrical. I didn't add commentary. I didn't write insults in the margins. I let the facts sit there like cold steel. Brent looked down, and I watched his face change in small steps, like a building losing power, floor by floor. He read the dates and the hotel charge, then the calendar conflict, then the deposit to the apartment portal. His mouth tightened. He asked if the charges were real. I nodded and showed him the screenshots on my phone, then put the phone down again. I wasn't here to convince him with performance. I was here to inform him with evidence. He asked why she would use my shared account. I told him the answer was simple: because she could. People like Vanessa treat boundaries as suggestions and consequences as optional. They don't cross lines because they think they are evil. They cross lines because they think they are entitled. Brent's jaw flexed at that, because he was starting to understand he wasn't the hero in a love story. He was a tool in someone else's strategy. Then he said the thing I had been waiting to hear, and his voice cracked just slightly when he said it. He told me Vanessa said the ring was symbolic. He told me she said it was a promise ring, a joke, something her friends pushed her into. He told me she said she wanted to talk to me and do it right. He said she had cried and told him I might retaliate. I almost smiled at that, not because it was funny, but because it was so predictable it could be scheduled on a shared calendar. Vanessa had preloaded the narrative. She had told him I might retaliate so that any consequence would look like proof of her warning. She had called my lawyer filings vindictive so the court would see her as the wounded party. She had left herself an escape hatch no matter which way the room turned. I asked Brent one more question, and I kept my tone flat. Did she tell you I moved her belongings out while she was at her parents'? He nodded, and his eyes flicked up like he expected me to defend myself. I didn't. I told him it was documented, legal, and done with a moving company and an inventory list. I told him I didn't destroy anything. I told him I didn't threaten her. I told him I simply removed my life from her reach. Brent stared at the timeline again, and I could see the exact moment he realized he had proposed to a woman who had been using two men like overlapping reservations. He leaned back, and for a second, he looked genuinely sick. Then he said quietly that he met her at a wedding vendor fair. She had introduced herself as single. She had said she was starting over. He said she made him feel chosen, like he was rescuing her from something complicated. That was the mid-level magic of someone like Vanessa. She didn't just lie. She tailored the lie to the listener's ego, so the listener became invested in defending it. Brent had been defending the lie because it made him feel important. Now he was trapped in the same humiliation I had been living in, just with nicer clothes and fewer receipts. I didn't ask him what he planned to do, because that would make it about my feelings. Instead, I told him one clean, practical thing. I told him if he married her without verifying the truth, he would inherit the consequences she was building. Then I slid the final screenshot across the table, the one that mattered most: the deposit, the apartment portal, my shared account paying for her next stage. Brent stared at it, and his hands began to shake, not violently, but enough to tell me the last of his denial was evaporating. He whispered that she told him she was moving into a place he had found for them, and that the deposit was supposed to be his. There it was, the second betrayal inside the first, neatly packaged. Vanessa wasn't just cheating. She was double-selling the same future to two different buyers, and she was funding the transaction with my money. Brent asked if I wanted him to confront her. He asked if I wanted him to tell her family, to call off the engagement, to expose her. The questions spilled out, desperate and hungry for a way to regain control. I stopped him with a small shake of my head, because this wasn't about what I wanted in the moment. It was about what could be proven, documented, and used to stop her from rewriting reality again. I told him to do what he needed to do, but to do it in writing, texts, emails, anything with timestamps. I told him not to threaten her, not to shout, not to give her a scene she could weaponize. Brent nodded like he was trying to memorize instructions for breathing. As we stood to leave, he said one last thing that made my stomach tighten in a new way. He said Vanessa had mentioned a lawyer she already talked to, and she sounded confident that she would get everything she asked for. He said she told him courts always side with women, and that I would learn my place. I left the bank cafe and sat in my car for a long minute, staring at the steering wheel like it had answers. Vanessa wasn't just reckless. She was strategic. She was building a story where I was the obstacle, and she was the survivor, and she had been rehearsing that story with an audience. When I got home, my phone buzzed again, and this time it wasn't a merchant alert. It was an email from Daniel with a single subject line that made my pulse slow down in a way that felt dangerous. New filing from opposing counsel, emergency motion. Vanessa wasn't done performing. She was escalating, and she was doing it fast. The email from Daniel was short enough to feel like a slap, but heavy enough to change the way the room sounded around me. And when I opened the attachment, the first thing I noticed was not the legal language, or the heading, or the case number, but the tone, because Vanessa had always written like she was speaking to a jury, even when she was ordering takeout. The motion was an emergency request for temporary orders, framed as if I had created an unstable living situation, as if I had thrown her out on a whim, as if I had hidden her property, as if I had been controlling the shared finances, and as if my calm refusal to negotiate was somehow evidence of danger. She wanted a court to believe that she was the reasonable party who had been blindsided, and that I was the unpredictable man who might do anything next, which was hilarious in the kind of way that stops being funny the moment you realize a judge has to read it. I didn't call her, because calling her was what she wanted. Vanessa didn't want answers. She wanted a reaction she could screenshot, misquote, and cry about later. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table and read every line twice, once for content and once for intention, and by the time I finished, I understood the shape of her play. She was trying to seize the narrative early, because if she could get temporary orders that favored her, then the rest of the case would feel like me trying to undo the normal the court had already accepted. Daniel called 5 minutes later, which told me he had predicted my pulse would spike and my judgment would wobble, and he wasn't letting that happen. He told me the motion was aggressive, but not clever, and he said she had overreached in a way that would be useful if we responded correctly. He asked me a question I didn't like, but I understood why he asked it. "Did you touch any of her things?" he said, without an inventory and receipts. "No," I said, because I had done everything like I was preparing for a fire inspection, and in a way, I was. "Did you block access to essential items?" he asked. "Medication, documents, work equipment?" "No," I said again, because my spite has never been sloppy, and my self-respect refuses to share a room with chaos. "Good," Daniel said, and I could hear the faint satisfaction in his voice. The satisfaction of a man who loves nothing more than watching someone build a trap and then walk into it. "She is alleging you used money to control her. We are going to answer with math." Math was one of the few things Vanessa never argued with, because math doesn't get tired, and it doesn't apologize, and it doesn't care if you cry. Daniel told me to forward every bank alert, every merchant notification, every time-stamped receipt, and any communication that referenced her girls' weekend or her engagement ring or her sudden need to talk. He also told me to send the moving company invoice, the inventory list, and photos from the day her belongings were moved, not because we needed to prove I was nice, but because we needed to prove I was orderly. In court, orderly looks like safe, and safe beats dramatic every time if you give the judge a clean path to believe it. I opened my folder again and started exporting things like I was preparing a case file for someone who didn't know me and didn't care about my feelings. The deposit to the property management portal, the application fee that followed, a merchant alert from a hotel restaurant that Vanessa had never mentioned, tied to a date she claimed she was with friends, a calendar conflict header from our shared week view, showing an overlap that made her story impossible because she had been at brunch at the same time she had allegedly been helping her mother. I printed each item, signed the back with the date I printed it, and put it in clear sleeves because it wasn't enough for the truth to exist. It had to look like it was handled by an adult. While I worked, my phone kept buzzing with messages from numbers I recognized, and a few I didn't. Vanessa's mother sent a long text about decency and forgiveness, and how I was punishing her daughter for finding happiness, which was a breathtaking reframing of fraud. One of Vanessa's friends sent a shorter message that was less spiritual and more threatening, implying I was going to regret being cruel. I didn't answer either of them. I saved both, because pressure campaigns are still campaigns, and campaigns leave patterns. Then Brent texted me again. He wrote that he confronted Vanessa, and that she said I was lying, and that I was trying to sabotage her because I couldn't handle rejection. He wrote that she cried and swore she had moved out months ago, and that she only stayed a few nights recently because she was afraid of me. He wrote that, when he asked about the shared account charges, she said I was spying on her, and that I must have hacked something to see them. The last line made my mouth go dry, not from fear, but from recognition. This was Vanessa's favorite trick. When caught, accuse. When pinned, claim violation. If she was the victim of surveillance, then the evidence became tainted, and I became the villain even while holding the receipt. She wanted the argument to shift from what she did to how I found out, because she knew what she did couldn't survive daylight. I responded to Brent with one sentence and nothing else. I did not hack anything, and these charges are on my own account alerts. He replied with another message that looked like he had typed it with shaking hands. She says she will file a protective order. There it was, the escalation she always kept in her back pocket, the nuclear threat meant to make everyone stop asking questions. A protective order changes the tone instantly. People stop thinking in facts and start thinking in risk. Employers get cautious. Friends get quiet. Even families start whispering because nobody wants to be caught defending the wrong person. I forwarded Brent's messages to Daniel, then I called him, and Daniel told me what I already suspected. "She is trying to box you into silence," he said, "because silence lets her story harden." He told me the emergency motion included a request for exclusive use of the residence, temporary support, and a court order requiring me to return withheld property, and it was crafted to imply I had acted impulsively and cruelly. He said we would respond with the moving company documentation, the inventory list, and a timeline of her spending patterns that showed she was not financially trapped. She was financially opportunistic. I asked Daniel if the court would take her seriously, and he answered like a man who has seen too many people get destroyed by assumptions. "The court takes allegations seriously," he said, "which is why we respond with proof and not anger." That night, I barely slept, not because I was spiraling, but because my mind was running through scenarios like a cautious accountant auditing a liar. If the judge granted her temporary orders, she would frame it as victory, and then she would run the clock because time is one of the most powerful weapons in any legal fight. She would want me exhausted, financially bled, socially isolated, and tempted to settle just to end the noise. I wasn't going to give her that. In the morning, Daniel asked me to come to his office early, before the day filled with other people's disasters. His office was quiet and plain, the kind of space designed to keep emotion from echoing, and when I arrived, he already had a draft response on his desk with neat bullet points and attached exhibits. He didn't speak first. He slid the draft toward me, and I read it slowly, and with every page, I felt something change in my chest, because this was what it looked like when someone translated chaos into structure. Vanessa's motion was full of theatrical language. Daniel's response was plain, factual, and ruthless in its calmness. He referenced dates, attached receipts, attached the inventory list, attached the moving company invoice, and included screenshots of the shared account charges that Vanessa claimed I could not possibly have seen without violating her privacy. He didn't call her a liar. He didn't call her selfish. He didn't call her anything. He just showed that her claims didn't fit the documented reality. Then he showed me the part that made the whole thing click. He had included a request of our own, temporary financial protections that prevented new charges on shared accounts without mutual consent, and a court-recognized inventory confirmation showing her property had been returned, which would stop her from claiming later that I stole something. It was the legal equivalent of closing every window in a storm while she was still pretending the roof wasn't leaking. "If she wants temporary orders," Daniel said, tapping the paper, "we give temporary clarity. Judges like clarity." I told him about the protective order threat, and Daniel nodded as if he had been expecting it since the day Vanessa bought her first dramatic perfume. "If she files," he said, "we respond the same way. Evidence, order, no drama." He asked me if I had any reason to believe she might claim I threatened her physically, and I said no, because I hadn't, and Daniel asked me if I had any texts where she acknowledged she was safe, or any messages that showed she was still engaging normally after the move-out. I remembered the voicemail from her mother, the one that said Vanessa was devastated but didn't mention fear, and I remembered the text Vanessa herself had sent the day before she left for her parents' house, the one where she complained about the timing and asked when she could pick up the rest. I had saved it, because I save everything now, and I forwarded it to Daniel, and he added it as an exhibit with the kind of quiet pleasure that should probably be illegal. On the way out, Daniel told me the hearing for temporary orders would likely happen within days, because courts move fast when someone uses the word emergency, and Vanessa had used it like a flare. He told me to keep my routine normal, to avoid any contact with her unless it was in writing and necessary, and to be prepared for her to show up somewhere public and try to provoke a scene. As I drove home, I noticed a car behind me for 3 turns, and my body did the stupid human thing of assuming pattern equals threat. But when the car pulled alongside at a red light, it was just a delivery van with a dented door and a bored driver. And I reminded myself that paranoia is what liars create in the people they betray. I wasn't going to live in that. When I got home, there was a package on my doorstep that I wasn't expecting. It was addressed to Vanessa, with her name spelled correctly in a handwriting I didn't recognize, and the return label was from a jewelry store across town. I didn't open it. I didn't touch it beyond moving it into the entryway so it wouldn't get stolen. I took a photo of the label, the tracking number, and the time on my phone screen in the same frame, because if Vanessa later claimed I withheld her mail, I wanted the truth ready. Then my phone buzzed again, and this time it was a calendar notification from the shared calendar. A new event added under Vanessa's name, one she must have forgotten, was still visible to me. Vendor meeting. Brent, 3 p.m. The audacity of it would have been impressive if it wasn't so stupid. She had just filed an emergency motion accusing me of controlling her life, and she was still using the shared calendar like I was a roommate who didn't exist. I exported the week view as a PDF, saved it, and then I stared at that event title until the sarcasm in my head turned into something colder. Because if Vanessa was still scheduling vendor meetings with Brent, then the engagement wasn't collapsing the way he thought it was, and if it wasn't collapsing, then it meant she believed she could win in court and keep her new life intact at the same time. And that meant the hearing wasn't just about temporary orders anymore. It was about whether the court would let her keep building a future on top of a lie, or whether the paper trail we had gathered would finally force reality to sit down in the room with her. I looked at the calendar entry one more time, then I forwarded the PDF to Daniel, and as I did, a new email came in from the court clerk's automated system with a subject line that made my stomach tighten in a very specific way. Notice of hearing scheduled. The notice didn't feel like information so much as a timer starting somewhere inside my chest, because a hearing date turns private mess into something scheduled, witnessed, and recorded. And once that happens, you stop living in a story and start living in a file. I forwarded the notice to Daniel, saved it to my folder, printed it, and set it on top of the growing stack of exhibits, as if paper could physically hold back chaos. Then I cleaned my kitchen the way some people clean a weapon, methodically, without emotion, because I needed my house to look like the home of someone reliable if anyone ever described it in court. Daniel called within the hour and told me the hearing was set for the following week, which meant Vanessa had succeeded in creating urgency without yet having to prove anything, and that was always her preferred terrain. He told me not to worry about speeches, not to worry about winning the room with charisma, and not to worry about what she might say about my character, because temporary orders hearings are about control, and control comes from documents that don't blink when someone cries. He also told me to expect a surprise, because Vanessa's type never walks into a room with only one plan. She would have a second narrative prepared for the moment the first one started to wobble, and if she sensed the judge leaning away from her, she would suddenly become reasonable, suddenly become conciliatory, suddenly become wounded, and then she would propose an agreement that sounded fair until you realized it was designed to lock me into losing slowly. I spent the next 2 days building my own version of reasonable, which in my world meant timestamps, receipts, and orderly labels, and by the second night, my coffee table looked like a crime scene had decided to go corporate. I had the moving company invoice, the signed inventory, the photos of boxes labeled by room, and the messages where Vanessa asked when she could pick up the rest, because a person who is terrified does not negotiate pickup windows with that kind of casual entitlement. I had merchant alerts from my own account, calendar exports showing overlaps, and the text from her mother that framed the situation as a moral disagreement instead of a safety concern, because families don't usually forget to mention fear if fear is real. Every time my mind tried to drift into anger, I pulled it back to the one truth that mattered. Vanessa wanted me off balance, because an off-balance man makes mistakes, and mistakes become leverage. On Friday, Daniel asked me to come in again, and when I arrived, he had a draft declaration for me to sign, written in the cleanest, coldest language I had ever seen, applied to my personal life. It described our relationship without romance, described the move-out without cruelty, described the financial accounts without drama, and described her emergency motion as a collection of claims that did not match the evidence attached, and reading it felt like watching someone drain color out of a painting until only the outline remained. Daniel walked me through each paragraph and asked me to confirm it was true, not emotionally true, but factually true, and every time I nodded, he made a mark and moved on. Because he wasn't building a story, he was building a record. He also told me he had filed a response already, with exhibits attached, and that Vanessa's attorney would receive it before the hearing, which meant she would have a few days to realize her strategy had run into something solid. "That's when people get creative," Daniel said, and I didn't need him to explain the rest. By Sunday afternoon, creative arrived in the form of my doorbell camera alert. Because Vanessa didn't knock like a normal person anymore, she pressed the button like she was ringing an alarm. I was in the living room when the notification hit, and for a moment I just stared at the screen, watching her stand there with her hair done, her posture stiff, her expression set in that practiced mixture of injury and entitlement that used to confuse me back when I still believed her emotions were spontaneous. I didn't open the door because a closed door is a boundary that requires less energy than a conversation, and within 30 seconds she started calling my phone because boundaries to her were just invitations to escalate. I let it ring. Then I sent a single text telling her to communicate through counsel and to leave the property because a sentence you can screenshot is safer than a conversation you can later reinterpret. She didn't leave, and that was the point. Because Vanessa didn't come to retrieve anything, she came to create an image. She wanted the neighbors to see her outside, to see her kept out, to see her as the wronged woman standing at the door of a home she supposedly couldn't access, because optics are her favorite currency. When she realized I wasn't moving, she took out her phone and started recording herself, speaking toward her screen with her shoulders angled just right for vulnerability, and even through the muted feed I could tell she was narrating a version of events designed to be shared. I didn't watch long enough to decode the words, because I didn't want the poison in my head, but I did save the doorbell clip, because even performance can become evidence when it shows someone calm, composed, and unafraid of the person they claim is dangerous. After 5 minutes, she walked away, not defeated, just recalculating. And later that night my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize, one that introduced itself as Vanessa's cousin and asked why I was doing this. I didn't respond, but I saved it, because the family pressure campaign was starting right on schedule. The next morning, Brent called me, and I almost didn't answer, because I was tired of being the bridge between two liars, but something in his tone sounded less arrogant than before. He asked if we could meet somewhere public, because he said he needed to show me something, and he sounded like a man trying to keep his hands from shaking while he held a door closed. I agreed, because public spaces make people behave, and I picked a cafe with large windows and too many witnesses. When I arrived, Brent looked like he had slept in his clothes, and the first thing he did was slide his phone across the table, open to a photo of Vanessa's engagement ring on her hand, taken in what looked like a hotel lobby mirror. The date stamp on the photo was from a week earlier than she had claimed, and the location tag was in a city she said she hadn't visited in months. He told me Vanessa said the ring belonged to her mother, that it was family, that she had only tried it on, and that the photo meant nothing. But he said the more he asked, the more her answers shifted. He also told me he had found a receipt in her bag for a jewelry resizing, paid in cash, and when he confronted her, she accused him of searching her things, and then she cried, and then she got angry, and then she threatened to tell people he was controlling, and hearing him say those words made my stomach drop with recognition, because she was using the same script on him that she was trying to use on me. He asked me if she had ever done that to me, the sudden flip from romance to accusation, and I didn't even need to think before I nodded, because my life had been a rehearsal for his moment. I told him I wasn't interested in revenge against him, because he was only the latest person she was building a story around. But I did tell him one thing he needed to understand, if he wanted to survive what was coming. I told him that Vanessa doesn't fight for love. She fights for the version of herself that keeps her from feeling shame, and if you threaten that version, she will burn you and call it self-defense. Brent's face tightened like he was trying not to believe me, but his eyes did the thing eyes do when they land on a truth they've been avoiding. He asked what he should do, and I told him to talk to his own lawyer, to protect his accounts, and to stop giving her chances to rewrite the timeline in his head, because the timeline was her battlefield, and she won there because most people don't document their own lives until it's too late. Before he left, he told me something that made the hearing feel suddenly bigger than it was supposed to be. He said Vanessa had told him I was unstable, and that she was going to get a court order so I couldn't contact her, and that she had a statement from someone who claimed they had seen me yelling at her in public. He said she told him it would be easy because people believe women, and she said it with the casual confidence of someone who treats serious accusations like strategy pieces. I felt my hands go cold around my coffee cup, not because I was afraid of the truth being questioned, but because I understood the mechanics of what she was doing. If she could frame me as volatile, then every boundary I set would look like punishment, every silence would look like menace, and every document I presented would look like obsession. She wasn't just trying to win temporary orders, she was trying to poison the lens through which the judge would see me. I got back to my car and sat there for a minute, staring at my own reflection in the rearview mirror, and I asked myself what I would look like to a stranger reading this case for the first time. A man who moved out her belongings while she was away could look cruel if you ignore context, and Vanessa was counting on the court ignoring context long enough for her to seize the wheel. I called Daniel immediately and told him about Brent, the ring photo, the earlier date, the location tag, and the talk of a witness statement, and Daniel didn't sound surprised, which was both comforting and depressing. He told me to send him the details, to avoid any direct contact with Brent after that, and to remember that witnesses can be neutralized by timelines, because a witness who claims they saw a public blow-up can be undermined if you prove you were somewhere else, or if you prove the supposed location doesn't match your schedule, or if you show the witness has a relationship to the person they're helping. When I got home, I opened my shared calendar export again and started mapping my own movements during the weeks Vanessa claimed I was unpredictable. I checked my receipts, my work logs, my gym attendance, and my email headers, not because I had anything to hide, but because when a liar starts inventing scenes, you need to be ready to prove the scene never happened. I printed the calendar weeks, highlighted the relevant days, and wrote notes in the margins like a man preparing for a trial he never asked for. That evening, a new email came in from Vanessa's attorney, and just seeing the subject line made my jaw tighten. The email requested that I return remaining personal items immediately, and it listed things that were already documented as returned, mixed with a few vague categories like sentimental items and personal records, which is the kind of wording people use when they want space to claim later that something irreplaceable is missing. I forwarded it to Daniel, then I walked into the spare room where the last few boxes sat, sealed, labeled, untouched, and I realized Vanessa wasn't asking for her things, she was laying ground for a future accusation. If she could claim I had withheld something meaningful, she could paint me as petty, vindictive, controlling, and judges hate petty men almost as much as they hate liars. I took photos of every box, every label, every seal, and I included my phone screen in the frame so the time was visible, because timestamps are the opposite of stories. Then I sat down and wrote a short, clear inventory addendum, and I printed it, signed it, and put it in a sleeve, because I was done improvising my safety. 2 days before the hearing, Daniel sent me our final exhibit packet, organized in a way that felt almost surgical, and he told me to read it once, then stop, because overthinking makes your face twitch in court, and face twitches become agitation in someone else's narrative. He told me to dress plainly, to arrive early, to say nothing to Vanessa, and to let him do the speaking, because the most satisfying revenge in a legal room is watching someone argue while you do not. That night, I got another doorbell alert, and this time it wasn't Vanessa. It was a man I didn't recognize, standing on my porch with a clipboard, looking down at his papers like he was reading a script. He glanced at the camera, then he glanced back at his clipboard, then he stepped closer to the door, and I felt my body tense before my mind caught up, because I knew what that posture meant. A process server doesn't come to chat. He knocked once, firm and practiced, then he raised the clipboard slightly as if the paper itself had authority, and even though I couldn't hear him through the door, I saw his mouth form words that I didn't need sound to understand because the whole situation was suddenly too familiar. He was there to deliver something Vanessa wanted on record before I walked into court, and whatever it was, she had timed it perfectly, because she knew the night before a hearing is when people finally crack. My first instinct was to stay still and let him leave, because a closed door creates uncertainty, and uncertainty is the one thing a person with a clipboard cannot tolerate for long. But then my second instinct arrived, sharper and colder, reminding me that dodging papers does not make them disappear. It only lets the other side rewrite the moment as cowardice. I turned on the porch light anyway, not because I wanted to be courteous, but because light is a signal to any camera and any witness that I was not hiding, and I opened the door with my phone already recording the timestamp on my own screen as casually as if I were checking the weather. The man introduced himself in that polite, flat way people use when they are trying to remain invisible in a situation that is inherently personal, and he asked if I was me, because they always ask even when they know. I confirmed it, kept my face neutral, and accepted the packet without asking questions, because questions are how you give someone the stage. He asked me to sign for it, and I declined, not aggressively, just calmly, because signatures are not required when delivery is witnessed and recorded, and I did not want Vanessa turning my signature into some insinuation later. He made a note, wished me a good night with the forced cheer of a man who has to say that line 10 times a day, and walked back to his car. I watched him go and felt a strange relief when he drove away, because at least now I knew what game she thought she was playing. I locked the door, turned off the porch light, and stood in my kitchen with the packet in my hand like it was a live wire. I didn't open it immediately, because I've learned that the first read of something designed to hurt you is not information, it is impact, and impact makes you stupid. Instead, I put the packet on the table beside my neatly stacked exhibits, washed my hands slowly, and made myself a cup of tea I did not want, because ritual is a leash for panic. Only after the tea was steaming and my breathing had settled into something close to normal did I sit down and slit the packet open. It was an emergency request for a temporary protective order, filed under the soft, poisonous language of fear for safety, and it had the familiar list of vague accusations that are impossible to disprove in the moment because they are built from feelings, not events. It claimed I had been controlling, that I had isolated her, that I had intimidated her during arguments, and that moving her belongings out while she was away proved I was unpredictable. It also included a declaration from a witness, someone who claimed to have seen me yelling at Vanessa outside a restaurant a few weeks earlier. The restaurant name on the declaration made my mouth go dry, because I had been at that restaurant, but not with Vanessa, and not in the way they described. I had been there alone, sitting at the bar, meeting Daniel for a brief consult, because he insisted we keep certain conversations out of my home, and the only person I had been yelling at was the bartender's television when the volume refused to work. The image of someone turning that mundane frustration into an incident was so absurd it almost made me laugh, but the laugh never arrived, because I knew how courts work when they are rushed and tired and trying to prevent worst-case scenarios. I read the packet again, slower, and that's when I noticed something that made my stomach twist with a different kind of dread. The witness's name wasn't random. It was someone I recognized from Vanessa's orbit, a woman who had liked her posts for years, who had hugged her at parties, who had always spoken to me with the kind of bright friendliness that feels rehearsed. She wasn't a stranger. She was a volunteer. Vanessa hadn't just filed paperwork. She had recruited an audience member to walk onto the stage. I called Daniel immediately, because the worst thing you can do with surprise papers is sit with them alone and let your imagination write the rest. He answered on the second ring, as if he had been waiting for my call, which told me he was already anticipating this exact move. I explained what I had received, read him the key claims, and then read the witness declaration name and the restaurant location. And Daniel was quiet for a beat, the way a man gets quiet when he sees the outline of the opponent's strategy. "She's trying to tilt the hearing," he said finally, and his voice was calm, which meant he was annoyed. He told me not to contact Vanessa, not to contact the witness, and not to post anything, because anything I did publicly would be harvested and framed. He told me to take photos of the packet, scan it if possible, and email it to him immediately. Then he told me to think back to that date and pull any objective proof of where I was and who I was with, because objective proof is the only language a judge can trust when everything else becomes a story. I told him I had been with him, and for the first time that night, I heard the faintest trace of satisfaction in his tone, because a lawyer loves nothing more than a lie that accidentally names a public place on a day your attorney can confirm. He asked me what time the declaration claimed the incident happened, and when I told him, he said, "Perfect," in the same way a surgeon says it right before making an incision. After we hung up, I sat there for a long moment, staring at my tea as it went cold, because I realized Vanessa wasn't just trying to win something small, she was trying to put a label on me that would follow me into every future interaction. If she could make me the unsafe one, then every boundary I set would look like aggression, and every calm refusal would look like manipulation. That label would shadow my finances, my work relationships, my friendships, and any future courtroom discussion, because even when allegations are dismissed, people still remember the headline version. I went into my office and opened my email thread with Daniel from the day in question. I searched the subject lines until I found the one where he suggested we meet in public. Then I found my own reply confirming the time. I checked my credit card notifications, not because I needed them for truth, but because truth needs a receipt in these rooms. Sure enough, there was a transaction from that restaurant at the exact time the witness claimed I was outside yelling at Vanessa, and the transaction showed a single meal, because my lawyer doesn't share my fries. I printed the email chain, then I printed the transaction line, and I placed both in sleeves with dates written in my own handwriting, because handwriting can become its own kind of anchor when people later claim documents appeared out of nowhere. I also saved the location history on my phone, not as some creepy surveillance tactic, but because it was my own device and my own movement, and I didn't need to manipulate it, just show it existed. I took screenshots of the relevant screen that confirmed I had been at that restaurant at that time. Then I put the screenshots in the same folder as everything else. It felt surreal to be building a defense against an accusation that hadn't existed yesterday. But that's how it works when the other side lives on improvisation. They throw paint at the wall and wait to see what sticks. And if you don't have a clean surface, you can't show what was added. That night, I barely slept, because my mind kept running future scenarios, like it was trying to rehearse every possible disaster into harmlessness. I imagined Vanessa crying in court. I imagined her attorney making a speech about vulnerability and fear. I imagined the judge taking the safest option and granting something temporary, just in case, because temporary orders are where caution beats truth. I imagined my building neighbors seeing a sheriff's car and whispering, my workplace hearing rumors, and my friends quietly shrinking away because no one wants to defend a man accused of being scary. The next morning, Daniel called again, and this time his voice had that clipped efficiency that meant he had already built a plan while I was stuck in my loop. He told me he had filed a response to her emergency request, and he had attached the exhibits that made her witness declaration look impossible, and he had also requested that the court treat her filing with caution due to the contradictions in her own communications. He told me, in simple terms, that her move was designed to scare me into reacting, and if I did not react, she would look like a woman swinging at air. I went to work that day, not because I felt productive, but because routine is a form of dignity. I did my job with the steady concentration of someone trying not to drop a glass, and when my phone buzzed with a message from a mutual friend asking if everything was okay, I knew Vanessa had already started the whisper campaign. I didn't answer with anger or details. I answered with a calm sentence, saying the matter was being handled through counsel because oversharing is how you give the wrong person a quote. Later that afternoon, my building superintendent called me to say Vanessa had been asking questions in the lobby again, and he sounded uncomfortable, like he wasn't sure whether he was reporting a problem or participating in drama. I thanked him, asked him to document any future interactions in the simplest possible way, and then I emailed Daniel about it, because documentation isn't paranoia when the other side is manufacturing scenes. 2 hours after that, my phone rang from an unfamiliar number, and when I answered, it was the same process server voice, this time telling me that Vanessa had requested I be served again with updated documents, which meant she was adding something, or rewriting something, or doubling down. I told him he could deliver through my attorney, and he said he would note it, which was the closest thing to a victory you get when someone else is determined to keep you in motion. That evening, I met Daniel in his office, and he showed me the draft of our opposition, and reading it was like watching someone turn a storm into a diagram. It listed Vanessa's claims, then listed the contradictions, then attached the exhibits that made the contradictions visible, and it did so without insult, because the court does not reward sarcasm, even when the situation deserves it. Daniel also warned me that Vanessa might show up the next day with a new witness or a new incident, because when a liar's first lie collapses, they don't stop lying, they just widen the stage. When I left Daniel's office, it was already dark, and I sat in my car for a minute with my hands on the wheel, feeling that strange mixture of exhaustion and clarity that comes when the threat is no longer abstract. Vanessa wasn't trying to be fair. She was trying to win by making me look like the villain and herself like the victim, because that was the only way she could justify the mess she had made. I drove home and found a voicemail on my phone from Vanessa's mother, and I didn't play it immediately because I already knew the tone it would carry. When I finally listened, it was exactly what I expected, a carefully modulated appeal to my better nature, implying that I was being harsh, that Vanessa was having a hard time, and that I should reconsider the path I was taking, as if truth were a route I had chosen out of spite. I saved the voicemail, because even manipulation becomes useful when it shows intent, and I added a note to my evidence ledger describing the time and the general content without emotion, because emotion doesn't help the record. That night, I laid out my court outfit on the chair like I was preparing for a job interview rather than a legal fight, because appearance matters more than it should in rooms where strangers decide your future in minutes. I set my alarm earlier than necessary, because rushing creates mistakes, and I sat at my kitchen table for a long time, staring at the neatly organized sleeves and wondering how Vanessa could still believe her performance would work when paper was waiting. Then my phone buzzed with an email from Daniel, short and direct, saying he had just received Vanessa's latest filing and that it contained a request for exclusive use of the apartment pending the case, framed as a safety necessity. I read it twice, feeling that cold focus settle in again because this was the real target all along. She didn't just want sympathy, she wanted territory, and she was planning to ask for it in front of a judge the next morning, with tears ready, witnesses ready, and a story designed to make me look like a danger in my own home. By the time morning arrived, I had already lived through the hearing 3 different ways in my head, which is a terrible habit if you enjoy sleep, and an excellent habit if you enjoy not being surprised by people who think tears can erase timestamps. I dressed like I was going to a boring corporate meeting, not like I was walking into a room where my ex would try to turn my character into a hazard sign, and I carried my folder the way you carry something fragile, because paper has a weird power in courtrooms where everyone pretends they are only listening to truth. Daniel met me outside the courthouse with the same calm expression he uses when he is about to do something unpleasant but necessary, and he didn't waste time reassuring me with motivational noise. He reviewed the plan in short sentences as we walked, reminding me that a temporary hearing is not a trial and not a full story, but it is often the first place a liar tries to plant a seed in the record, because seeds are easier to grow than they are to uproot. He told me again not to interrupt Vanessa, not to react to dramatics, and not to help her by becoming the exact man she was describing, which is a ridiculous thing to need to say to another adult. But here we were. The waiting area looked like every waiting area in every civil building, with hard chairs, pale walls, and that nervous silence that makes people speak in half whispers, even when the subject is their own life. Vanessa arrived 10 minutes after us, dressed in soft colors and innocent lines, because she had chosen her outfit the way a person chooses a costume, and she brought her attorney, a man who smiled too much and looked at me like I was a puzzle he had already solved. Vanessa also brought her mother, because she believed witnesses mattered more when they share blood, and she brought the witness from the restaurant declaration, because she couldn't resist showing me that she had an audience on command. I did not acknowledge them beyond a polite nod, because courtroom hallways are a stage built for micro scenes, and Vanessa loved micro scenes the way arsonists love dry weather. Her attorney tried to initiate small talk, the kind that is meant to seem cordial while actually fishing for tone and weakness. But Daniel shut it down with a single sentence that made it clear our communication would be formal and limited, and that any informal attempt would be treated as an attempted shortcut around counsel. I watched Vanessa's face as that happened, and I could see the irritation beneath the practiced calm, because she wanted this to feel like a negotiation where she could dominate, not a process where rules applied evenly. When our case was called, we filed into the courtroom and took our places, and the judge looked tired in the way judges always look tired, which made me even more determined not to be the person who wasted their patience with theatrics. Vanessa sat with her shoulders slightly hunched, her hands folded, her eyes shiny, and I almost admired the discipline of it, because acting is exhausting when you have to maintain continuity across different rooms. Her attorney began with the same soft framing I had read in the packet, painting her as fearful, painting me as unpredictable, and treating the fact that I had moved her belongings out as if it were proof of instability instead of what it actually was, which was a logistical response to betrayal and an attempt to avoid a messy confrontation. Vanessa's attorney referenced the restaurant incident as if it were a cornerstone, and he introduced the witness declaration with the confidence of a man who assumes documents automatically equal credibility. Vanessa glanced at me at exactly the right moment, checking whether her story was landing, and I gave her nothing, because nothing is the worst thing you can give someone who is used to reactions. The judge listened, asked a few clarifying questions, and then looked at Daniel, and that was when the air in the room shifted slightly, because questions in court are like a door clicking shut, which means the judge is ready to decide whether they are hearing a performance or a pattern. Daniel responded without raising his voice, without insulting anyone, and without giving the judge extra emotions to manage, and he did exactly what he told me he would do, which was treat Vanessa's claims like a math problem. He laid out the timeline of the alleged incident. Then he presented the email chain showing that I had been meeting him at that restaurant at the exact time Vanessa's witness claimed I was outside arguing with Vanessa, and then he presented the transaction line that matched the time and confirmed a single purchase. He didn't offer it as a dramatic gotcha, because judges don't like drama, but he did offer it as a simple contradiction that could not be argued into another shape without snapping. Vanessa's attorney tried to pivot, because pivoting is what you do when your foundation cracks, and he suggested that I could have met my attorney after the alleged argument, or that the timing could be approximate, or that the witness might have misunderstood the parties involved. Daniel didn't fight the pivots with rhetoric, because rhetoric is slippery, and instead he asked the judge to notice the specific time printed on the receipt line and the specific time in the witness declaration, and the fact that both times were unusually exact for something described as emotional and chaotic. The judge looked down again, and in that pause I could almost feel Vanessa realizing that the story she thought would carry her had just been forced to carry weight, which it could not. Then came the real reason we were there, the request Vanessa had added at the last minute, the demand for exclusive use of the apartment, framed as safety and stability, and presented as if I were a hazard that needed to be removed from my own home. Her attorney argued that Vanessa needed the apartment because she had nowhere else, which was interesting, considering she had parents within driving distance who were currently supporting her performance from the second row. He implied that granting her the apartment would lower conflict, which is a common lie in legal language, because rewarding a liar rarely lowers conflict. It just teaches them which lever moves the world. The judge asked Vanessa whether she had alternative housing options, and Vanessa answered in the careful, wounded manner that suggested she had rehearsed the phrasing, and I noticed she avoided specifics, because specifics are where lies start bleeding. The judge then asked Daniel about my housing situation, and Daniel kept it simple, reminding the court that I had been the primary leaseholder, that I had maintained the payments, and that forcing me out under a temporary order would create a burden that was not justified by evidence, especially when the predicate allegation about my unpredictability had already been undermined by documents. Vanessa's attorney attempted to widen the frame again, suggesting patterns of control, patterns of emotional intimidation, patterns that can't be disproven in a 10-minute hearing because they are designed to be fog. Daniel didn't let him drift into fog because Daniel is allergic to fog, and he gently pulled the judge back to what was actually in front of the court, which was a request for an emergency order based on claims that now had visible contradictions. He pointed out still calmly that Vanessa had not presented medical records, police reports, or any corroboration beyond a single witness statement that appeared mistaken at best and constructed at worst, and he asked the judge to be cautious about granting a life-altering temporary order based on narratives that were already failing the simplest consistency check. The judge leaned back, looked at Vanessa, and asked her a question that sounded polite but felt sharp, because it required her to commit to a detail. Vanessa hesitated for half a beat, and her attorney tried to answer for her, but the judge redirected the question back to Vanessa, and that's when Vanessa's voice changed slightly, because she realized she was being asked to step out of the script and into the record. She answered, but the answer didn't match the timing in her own filing, and the judge noticed, because judges may be tired, but they are not blind to a person who keeps moving the goalposts. The decision that followed was not a grand victory with thunderous consequence, but it was the kind of quiet ruling that matters, because it prevents a false story from becoming a legal reality by default. The judge declined to grant the temporary protective order as requested, and the judge declined to grant Vanessa exclusive use of the apartment, and instead set a path forward that involved formal process and clearer evidence standards, with the kind of tone that made it obvious the court would not be a playground for improvisation. The judge reminded both sides to avoid contact beyond necessary logistics, and then moved on, because courts are assembly lines of human conflict, and our pain was just one more file on a cart. In the hallway afterward, Vanessa tried to salvage the moment by creating a new scene, because she couldn't accept losing the first round without rewriting it as persecution. She spoke loudly enough for the nearby people to hear, aiming her words at the air between us rather than at me, which is how you manufacture the illusion of being brave without risking an actual response. Her attorney tried to corral her, her mother looked furious, and the restaurant witness suddenly looked less confident, because it is hard to stand next to a story once the court has quietly demonstrated the story does not fit the math. Daniel touched my elbow and guided me away, because he understood that the hallway is where dumb decisions are made, and he had no interest in letting Vanessa bait me into a reaction she could film, narrate, or repurpose into her next filing. We walked toward the exit, and behind us Vanessa's voice rose again, sharper now, the tone of someone arguing with a wall that refuses to crack, and I felt a grim satisfaction in the simple reality that the wall had paperwork. Outside, the cold air hit my face like a reset, and for a moment I just stood there, listening to traffic and letting my nervous system remember that I wasn't trapped in that building. Daniel spoke quietly, telling me the ruling was a good sign, but also warning me that Vanessa would escalate, because people who lose a manipulation tactic rarely accept the loss as feedback, and instead treat it as a reason to try a worse tactic. He told me we were now in the phase where we document everything, where we respond through counsel, where we stay boring and precise, and where we let Vanessa exhaust herself trying to fight the record. I nodded, because boredom is the most powerful weapon against drama, and I watched the courthouse doors as they opened again, expecting Vanessa to storm out in tears, but instead she lingered inside, still talking, still gesturing, still demanding that someone validate her narrative as if volume could replace evidence. I didn't wait for her to finish her performance, because I didn't need closure from a person who manufactures conflict for comfort. And I didn't need the satisfaction of watching her spiral, because spirals eventually turn into filings. So I did the simplest thing I could do in that moment, the thing that would hurt her more than an argument ever could, and I turned my back on the scene entirely. I walked away with Daniel beside me, my folder under my arm, my phone in my pocket, and my face neutral, leaving Vanessa behind in the courthouse hallway, still arguing with empty air as if the air could be pressured into giving her everything she demanded. By the time I reached my car, my phone buzzed with a new email notification from Daniel's office, and the subject line made my stomach tighten again, because it was the first sign that Vanessa had already started her next move before the last one had even cooled. The email was from Daniel, and the subject line was the kind of polite phrasing lawyers use when they are trying not to sound like they are swearing at their screens, because it read, "New filing and proposed stipulation," which is basically a bow on a brick. I sat in my car for a full minute without starting the engine, watching people drift across the courthouse steps like nothing important had happened, and that was the first time it hit me that my whole life had become a document exchange that other strangers would experience as a minor administrative inconvenience. Daniel's message was short, but each sentence carried weight like it had been carefully measured, and the gist was simple. Vanessa had filed an amended request within hours. She was now claiming I had retaliated by moving her out. She was asking for temporary support, and she had attached a proposed stipulation that would have me agree to a list of restrictions that sounded reasonable on the surface, but functionally turned me into the one who had to prove I was harmless every day. Daniel wrote that we would respond, that we would keep it narrow, and that the court's earlier skepticism would help, but the last line was the one that mattered, because he wrote that Vanessa had also requested an emergency mediation session and had included a list of witnesses, including someone I recognized as the fiancé. I read that name 3 times, because I wasn't sure my brain was processing it correctly, and then I looked at the courthouse doors again as if Vanessa might appear holding a neon sign that said, "Surprise," because her talent was always in making chaos feel like inevitability. The fiancé's name was Oliver Price, and I knew that because I had heard it once before in a context that seemed harmless at the time, a casual comment about a friend from volunteering, a man who had helped her plan the girls' weekend itinerary, and I remembered how she had said the name too quickly, like she didn't want it to settle on the surface of the conversation. I drove home on autopilot, but my mind did not come with me because it stayed pinned to that name and the implication behind it, which was that Vanessa wasn't just trying to win a hearing, she was trying to reframe the entire story so she could walk away with clean hands and a new ring, while still using me as the villain who forced her into the next chapter. I had already moved her things out because I refused to be the man she kept in a drawer for convenience, and now she was trying to punish that refusal by creating a legal version of me that could be controlled. When I pulled into the building's parking lot, I saw the first symptom of the new phase waiting for me, because there were two neighbors standing near the mailboxes pretending to check their phones while actually watching the entrance. The gossip had started before I even drove back from court, and I knew that because a building has its own social bloodstream, and bad news moves faster than elevators. I nodded to them, kept my face blank, and walked past, but I felt the same sensation you feel when you know your name is being used in conversations you are not allowed to enter. Inside, my apartment looked exactly the same, which was insulting in its own way, because nothing about my life felt stable, but the objects still sat where they always sat, like they believed in routine. Vanessa's side of the closet was empty, the bathroom shelf had more space, the kitchen drawer no longer held her favorite tea, and those details should have made me feel relief, but instead they made me feel like I was living in a set after the actors had quit. I placed my folder on the counter, checked the locks out of habit, and then sat down with my laptop, because now every emotion had to be converted into action if I wanted to stay sane. Daniel had already forwarded the filing, and I read it slowly, forcing myself to treat it like an inventory, not an insult, because if you read legal accusations like they are personal letters, you end up reacting like a wounded person instead of responding like a stable adult. Vanessa's new narrative was a smoother version of the old one, because she had learned from the judge's reaction and adjusted her performance, and she was now claiming that she had returned from a planned trip, only to be ambushed by hostile demands and ejected without notice, which was a funny way to describe someone coming back with an engagement ring and a prepared speech about needing to talk. She alleged that I had withheld property, which was false, because I had documented everything and arranged it carefully, and she alleged that I had interfered with her employment, which was also false, because I had not spoken to her workplace and I had not touched her professional life. But the most strategic part was the support request, because it was framed as temporary help during transition, and the court tends to like transitions, because transitions sound humane, and she was trying to build a bridge out of her own betrayal by having the system pay for it. The stipulation she proposed was where the real manipulation lived, because it had terms about communication, property access, and mutual respect, and each line sounded like something a reasonable person would agree to, except for the fact that it would give her permission to enter the building, retrieve items, and create new scenes with witnesses present, while also restricting me from speaking to anyone in the building about what happened. She wanted silence from me, access for her, and a legal muzzle wrapped in polite language, because she understood that the only thing more dangerous than evidence is a man who stays calm while telling the truth. I called Daniel, because I needed the reality check that only a lawyer can provide when your blood is trying to make decisions for you, and he answered quickly, like he had been expecting it. He confirmed that we would not agree to the stipulation as written, and he told me that Vanessa was trying to manufacture urgency to force concessions, because urgency makes people sign things they later regret. He also told me that the fiancé's inclusion was new, and that it suggested Vanessa was either trying to intimidate me socially or trying to build a narrative that she had a safe alternative while still claiming she needed support from me, which is the kind of contradiction that courts do not love once it is pointed out. Then Daniel said something that made my stomach go tight again, because he told me that Vanessa's attorney had informally suggested a global settlement that would include a non-disparagement clause and a confidentiality clause, and Daniel's tone made it clear he smelled the trap from across the room. A confidentiality clause in a breakup like this is not about privacy. It is about controlling who gets to tell the story, and Vanessa was obsessed with telling it first, because she believed that the first version becomes the truth by default. After the call, I sat in silence, letting the anger burn itself down into something more useful, and I realized the next move could not be emotional, because Vanessa had built her entire strategy around provoking emotion. She wanted me loud, she wanted me messy, she wanted me to send a text that could be screenshot, she wanted me to show up at her parents' house and argue, she wanted me to do anything that would give her a new object to hold up in court and say, "See, this is who he is." So I did what she hated most, which was, I stayed boring, and I stayed procedural, and I focused on building a clean record. That evening, I received a message from the building manager, a short note asking me to confirm whether Vanessa was still a tenant, because there had been questions at the front desk, which was the manager's polite way of saying that Vanessa had probably called someone and stirred the pot. I replied with a simple statement, factual and restrained, explaining that she no longer lived here and that any access requests should be directed through counsel, and then I forwarded the exchange to Daniel, because now even mundane emails were evidence in the war of perception. The next day brought the second symptom, and it arrived in the form of a doorman I had never seen before greeting me with forced cheer, like someone had warned him I might explode. He asked if everything was all right, in that careful tone people use when they are trying to measure your mood for safety, and I smiled and said I was fine, because I refused to become a story. I could feel the building shifting around me, doors closing a little quicker, conversations pausing when I entered the lobby, and I understood that Vanessa had already begun the smear, because she couldn't tolerate the idea that she might be the one people judged. At lunch, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number asking if I was the guy Vanessa used to live with, and the message ended with a laughing emoji that felt like a slap. I stared at it for a long time, not because it hurt, but because it confirmed that she had widened the circle, and she had invited strangers into the story, because that's what people do when they need external validation for internal guilt. I did not respond, and I saved the message, and I made a note of the time, because I had learned that even noise becomes useful when you are building a pattern. That evening, Daniel emailed again, this time with an update on the emergency mediation request, because the mediator's office had offered an opening in 3 days, and Vanessa's attorney had insisted on it, citing ongoing emotional distress and housing instability. Daniel wrote that we would attend because refusing would look unreasonable, but we would control the frame, and we would bring documentation of the move-out process, the property inventory, and the timeline that contradicted her narratives. He also wrote that Vanessa had submitted a list of personal property disputes, claiming I had kept items that were either clearly mine or had been left behind, and the list included a watch I had never seen and a laptop I knew she did not own, which meant she was inflating the dispute to create bargaining chips. I printed the inventory sheets I had created when I packed her belongings, and I laid them out on the table, and I went through every line like a person auditing a crime scene, because that's what it felt like, a crime scene made of domestic items. I had photographs of boxes, photos of labels, a time-stamped delivery receipt for the moving service, and a message from her mother acknowledging that the items had arrived at their house. It was all ordinary, and that was the point, because ordinary proof is harder to dramatize away. While I was working, a new email arrived, this time not from Daniel, but from an address I recognized, because it was Vanessa's personal email, and the subject line simply said, "We need to handle this like adults." I didn't open it immediately, because I understood the game, and the game was that she wanted direct contact, which meant she wanted a chance to provoke, twist, and screenshot. I forwarded it to Daniel without reading it. Then I replied through Daniel's office with a standard instruction that all communication should go through counsel, and I felt a strange satisfaction in the simplicity of that boundary. The next morning, I woke to a voicemail from a number I didn't recognize, and I listened to it once, then again, because the voice was calm and male and trying very hard to sound reasonable. The man introduced himself as Oliver, and he said he wanted to clear the air, and he said he didn't want hostility, and he said he was reaching out because Vanessa was having a hard time, and he thought we could avoid making this ugly. He never mentioned the engagement ring, but the ring was in every word, because he was speaking like a man who believed he had the right to manage Vanessa's consequences by negotiating with me like I was a minor obstacle. I did not call him back, because I did not need a conversation with the replacement, and I did not need to give Vanessa a story about how I harassed her fiancé. Instead, I saved the voicemail, noted the timestamp, and forwarded it to Daniel, because the mere fact that Oliver contacted me directly after being listed in her filings suggested coordination, and coordination suggests intent. Later that day, I got the confirmation that Vanessa had fully committed to controlling the narrative, because a neighbor I was friendly with, an older woman named Marlene who had always been polite in an aloof way, stopped me in the hallway and asked, with the soft concern of someone repeating a rumor, whether I was doing okay, because she had heard Vanessa was scared. The word scared hung in the air like a dirty trick, and I saw how Vanessa had chosen it carefully, because scared triggers protection in people who don't want to investigate details. I told Marlene I was fine, and I told her I couldn't discuss private matters, and I kept my voice steady, but I watched her face shift because she wanted a dramatic denial or an angry outburst, and I gave her neither. I could feel the tension in my chest as I walked away, because the hardest part of being falsely cast as a villain is resisting the urge to defend yourself publicly, since public defense always looks like guilt to people who love stories. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the evidence folder open, and I realized Vanessa's real goal was not winning money or getting temporary access. Her real goal was rewriting the moral record. She wanted to leave the relationship with a new ring and a clean conscience, and she could only do that if she turned me into a monster who forced her hand. The legal filings, the whispers in the lobby, the texts from strangers, the voicemail from Oliver, all of it was one continuous strategy, to make the breakup look like my failure, not her betrayal. I stared at Daniel's mediation prep checklist, and I understood something that felt both bleak and clarifying, because it meant the next phase would not be about the past. It would be about controlling the next 30 days. Vanessa would escalate pressure, she would stage scenes, she would seek sympathy, and she would try to trick me into giving her one usable moment of anger. And if she succeeded, she could drag the entire process into a fog of he said, she said that would make her lies feel equal to my facts. So I made my decision quietly, the way you decide to stop arguing with the weather and start carrying an umbrella instead. I would not chase her, I would not plead, and I would not react, because reactions were her currency. I would attend mediation with a clean record. I would let her perform into the emptiness of her own contradictions, and I would force every claim she made to pass through the narrow door of documentation. Then my phone buzzed again, and this time it was a calendar notification Daniel's office had added for me, and the title of the event made my mouth go dry because it read, Mediation Session. Attendance confirmed. Vanessa plus Oliver. Which meant the next room would not just contain my ex and her lawyer, but also the man wearing her new ring as if it were a prize. And I knew, with a calm certainty that felt almost peaceful, that Vanessa didn't bring him to mediate. She brought him to watch me bleed, and I had no intention of giving her that show. The mediation office sat on the third floor of a glass building that smelled like printer toner and lemon cleaner, and the hallway was lined with framed posters about cooperation, which felt like someone hanging motivational quotes in a boxing gym. I arrived 10 minutes early because punctuality is one of the few legal advantages a person can control, and because I wanted to see the room before Vanessa entered it, like she owned the air. Daniel had told me to dress neutral, to speak less than I wanted to, and to never fill silence for other people, so I wore a simple jacket and carried one folder, even though I had a second folder in my bag like a spare tire. The receptionist smiled too brightly as she checked my name, then glanced at the calendar on her screen, with the small stiffening that happens when a professional realizes today will be messy. She offered water, pointed me to a chair, and I sat facing a frosted glass door that said, Mediation Suite B, in neat lettering, like the door itself was trying to appear innocent. I watched the clock, listened to the building's low mechanical hum, and felt my thoughts flatten into a cold, usable line, because I had learned that anger burns energy, while focus stores it. Vanessa arrived 5 minutes before the session, and she did not come alone. She walked in wearing a coat that looked expensive without looking flashy, the kind of item chosen to say stable, and her hair was styled in that careful way that tells you someone practiced in front of a mirror. Oliver walked beside her, half a step behind, which wasn't accidental, because even when she pretends to be soft, she still arranges bodies around her like furniture. The ring on her finger caught the overhead lights when she shifted her hand, and she did not try to hide it, because she wanted me to see it, and because she believed that seeing it would make me behave the way she needed. Oliver looked taller than I expected, not imposing so much as polished, like a man who had spent his life being told he seemed trustworthy. He scanned the waiting area, noticed me, and his face tightened in a faint, reflexive expression of calculation. It was the same expression I'd heard in his voicemail, the calm tone of someone who thinks the world works out if you speak like a manager. He gave me a nod that was supposed to be civilized, a gesture designed to make any tension look like my choice, and I returned it with nothing in my eyes, because I refused to give him the satisfaction of reading me. The mediator stepped out a moment later, a woman in her 40s with a clipboard and a practiced calm that had nothing to do with kindness and everything to do with experience. She introduced herself as Evelyn Hart and guided us into the room. The table was oval, the chairs were padded, and there was a box of tissues placed exactly where it could be used as both comfort and prop. Evelyn invited us to sit, explained the ground rules, and asked us to keep statements brief and factual, which sounded ideal until you remember that people like Vanessa use facts the way others use perfume, as a light mist to cover what they actually did. Daniel arrived last, moving with the easy confidence of someone who has seen every flavor of human self-deception and no longer flinches. He nodded to me, shook Evelyn's hand, and sat beside me with a thin folder and a tablet. Vanessa's attorney, a man with a soft face and sharp eyes named Brent Caldwell, settled beside her and placed his hands flat on the table, like he was about to lead a prayer. Oliver sat near Vanessa, not exactly at her side, but close enough to look involved, and I could feel the mediator clocking that arrangement, because third-party presence always complicates the purpose of the room. Evelyn asked Vanessa to explain why she had requested emergency mediation, and Vanessa took a breath that was too controlled to be natural. She spoke about feeling destabilized, about returning from a trip to find her life uprooted, about being forced to rely on her parents, and about being concerned for her safety because I had been unpredictable. She used the word unpredictable with a delicate tremor in her voice, and she looked down for half a second as if emotion was leaking out of her by accident. She did not mention the ring directly, but she let it stay visible on the table like an unspoken thesis. While she spoke, Oliver watched me with the mild tension of a man listening to a story he had agreed to support, and I could see his loyalty shifting between confidence and unease. He wanted to believe her, and he also wanted the problem to remain solvable, and those are not the same desire. Vanessa's attorney followed her statement by framing the issue as a transition dispute, emphasizing her need for temporary financial support and requesting structured access to retrieve personal property, all while implying that my decision to move her belongings had been rash and punitive. Daniel waited until they finished, and then he spoke in the tone of a man laying out bricks in a straight line. He said we were here because Vanessa filed an amended request built on claims that did not match the documented timeline. He said we would not argue feelings. He said we would focus on property and practical boundaries. Then he looked at Evelyn and explained, without dramatics, that Vanessa had moved out because she returned from a girls' weekend wearing an engagement ring belonging to another man, and that her own statements to me indicated she intended to replace the relationship while still controlling the terms of her departure. Vanessa's eyes narrowed for a fraction of a second, the real expression slipping through before she reset her face into wounded patience. Oliver's jaw shifted, not a full reaction, but the kind of muscle movement you notice when someone is fighting with their own assumptions. He had likely been told a version where Vanessa and I had been separated, or where I had been controlling, or where the engagement was complicated but justified. Hearing Daniel stated as plain fact in a neutral room did something to Oliver's posture, and he sat a little straighter, like he needed to protect himself from embarrassment. Evelyn asked if we had documentation related to the move-out process, and Daniel slid a clear sleeve across the table, not toward Vanessa, but toward Evelyn, because there is power in choosing who receives the record first. Inside the sleeve were printed photographs of boxes labeled with dates, a written inventory list, and a delivery receipt for the moving service, along with a brief acknowledgement message from Vanessa's mother confirming the delivery. Daniel explained that the items were moved while Vanessa was at her parents' house, that her family accepted delivery, and that the process was designed to avoid confrontation, not to create it. Vanessa tried to interrupt with a statement about missing items, and Daniel did not argue. He simply opened his folder and produced the list she had submitted, and then he placed next to it an annotated version of the inventory with check marks, item categories, and a note explaining which items were hers, which were mine, and which were shared. He pointed out that several items she claimed were missing had never existed in the household records, including a watch I had never seen and a laptop that did not match any known purchase. He did not accuse her of lying. He allowed the paperwork to imply it, because accusation creates a fight, while evidence creates a problem. Evelyn asked Vanessa to clarify the disputed items, and Vanessa's voice tightened as she shifted into a more defensive story, one where she had kept things informal and had trusted me, and now she felt punished for it. The word punished landed like bait. She wanted me to react, to deny with anger, to look like a man obsessed with winning. Instead, I sat still and let Daniel speak, because the calmness itself was a kind of refusal, and refusal is the opposite of the emotional supply she needed. Oliver finally spoke, carefully, asking why she hadn't simply arranged a normal move-out with me, and Vanessa's head turned toward him with a warning softness, the kind you only notice if you have seen someone control a room before. She answered by saying she was afraid of conflict and that she didn't know how I would respond, and I watched Oliver's expression shift again, because he was now positioned as the man who was supposed to protect her from me, yet he was also learning that she had made major life decisions without basic logistics. It is hard to feel like a rescuer when you realize the person you are rescuing is also managing you. Evelyn asked about the financial request, and Brent outlined Vanessa's claim for temporary support and reimbursement for housing disruption. Daniel responded by emphasizing that Vanessa had already established alternative housing with her family, that her disruption was connected to her own decision to accept an engagement while living with me, and that she was attempting to create a financial bridge between two relationships without acknowledging the overlap. Evelyn's eyes flicked once to Vanessa's ring, then back to her notes, and I could tell she had filed that detail in the part of her brain labeled pattern. Vanessa then made the move I had expected, the one where she tries to shift the arena from facts to character. She described me as emotionally cold, withholding, and strategic, suggesting that I had orchestrated the move out to humiliate her. The word humiliate appeared with a slight shake, as if she were the victim of cruelty rather than the architect of a double life. It was a beautiful attempt, because it framed my calm as malice. Oliver watched me closely at that point, waiting to see if I would snap, and I realized he was the real audience for her performance, not the mediator, because if she could keep Oliver believing she was wronged, she could keep her new life from feeling like theft. Daniel responded with a single sentence that changed the temperature. He told Evelyn that Vanessa had listed Oliver as a witness in her filing, implying Oliver had relevant knowledge of the timeline while Vanessa was still living with me. Evelyn paused, and that pause was not accidental. It was the pause of someone seeing the outline of a bigger conflict. She asked directly what Oliver's involvement was during the period Vanessa lived with me, and Vanessa's attorney attempted to soften it by claiming Oliver was only involved after the relationship ended in practice. That phrase, ended in practice, sounded like a legal trick wearing casual clothes, and Evelyn did not seem amused. She looked at Vanessa and asked if she had told Oliver she was still living with me at the time of the engagement. Vanessa's mouth tightened, and the room held its breath, because every person there understood that a simple yes could cause personal fallout, and a no could create credibility fallout. Oliver's eyes moved to Vanessa's face, and for the first time he looked less like a confident fiancé and more like a man realizing he might be standing on a trapdoor. Vanessa answered in a way that tried to be both yes and no. She said she had been in transition, that she and I were separating, that living arrangements were complicated, and that Oliver had been supportive through a difficult time. She said it with the careful cadence of someone who rehearsed on the drive over. Oliver's cheeks colored slightly, not from anger, but from the slow bloom of embarrassment, because he had likely told friends and family a simpler story, and now the official room was peeling it apart. Evelyn asked to take a short break, and when we stood, Vanessa's hand touched Oliver's forearm, a small claiming gesture that looked affectionate, but functioned like a leash. Oliver's eyes met mine for half a second, and in that glance I saw the first crack in his certainty, because he wasn't looking at me like an enemy anymore. He was looking at me like a man trying to estimate how long he had been lied to, and whether he had volunteered for a role he didn't understand. In the hallway, Daniel leaned close and told me, quietly, that this was exactly why Vanessa had demanded emergency mediation, because she wanted to control the story before a court could interrogate it. He said we would not engage emotionally. He said we would push for written boundaries and a clean record of her contradictions. Then he added something that made my stomach tighten again, because he said Brent had just whispered that Vanessa was considering requesting a temporary order preventing me from speaking publicly about the engagement overlap, which meant the confidentiality trap was still moving under the surface. When we returned to the room, Evelyn proposed a structured agreement, a final date for property claims, a written inventory confirmation, a no-contact boundary except through counsel, and a withdrawal of the emergency support request pending a standard hearing, because the urgency no longer looked urgent. Vanessa's attorney pushed back, and Vanessa's composure began to fray, because she could feel control slipping. She argued that I was stonewalling, that I was punishing her with procedure, and that my lawyer was twisting events. I watched her talk faster, watched her gestures sharpen, and I recognized the familiar pattern of Vanessa trying to win by exhausting the room. Evelyn remained calm, but her tone shifted into firmer territory as she repeated that mediation works only when claims align with records. Vanessa's eyes flashed toward me, and I could tell she wanted a reaction, any reaction, because if I reacted, she could pivot into victimhood again and drag the session into emotional mud. I did not speak until Evelyn asked me directly what I wanted. I said I wanted a clean end. I said I wanted documented boundaries. I said I wanted her property claims closed by a clear deadline. I said I wanted no unplanned access to my home or building. I said it in a voice that didn't rise, and I watched Oliver's face change again, because this was not the voice of an unstable man. It was the voice of someone finished with negotiation. Evelyn wrote notes, Brent adjusted his posture, and Vanessa's mouth tightened into something that looked like disbelief. Then her phone buzzed on the table, and she glanced down instinctively before catching herself, and that tiny slip felt like the universe tapping a finger on the glass. She flipped the phone face down quickly, but I had already seen the name on the screen in the lock preview, and it wasn't Oliver's. It was someone saved as Mom, and beneath it, in the preview line, I caught 5 words that landed like a hammer. Did he say anything about us? Vanessa's eyes lifted, and for a split second she looked afraid, not of me, but of what was happening in the room. Oliver noticed her shift, and he leaned slightly as if to see the phone, and she placed her hand over it too fast to be casual. The mediator didn't notice, but I did, because I have spent weeks training myself to notice small things that reveal larger truths. Daniel kept speaking with Evelyn about the proposed terms, and I nodded along, but my focus had narrowed to one cold, sharp point. Vanessa had brought Oliver here to watch me bleed, but she had not accounted for the fact that pressure makes people slip, and slips become leverage. If her mother was texting about us, then the story was wider than Oliver. It meant Vanessa had been staging this with her family's knowledge, or at least with their involvement, and that meant the next fight would not just be in court or mediation. It would be in the social story she was trying to preserve. Evelyn scheduled a follow-up, set provisional terms on paper, and ended the session with the kind of polite firmness that tells you she had already decided who was bending reality. As we stood, Vanessa looked at me with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes, and Oliver avoided her gaze for half a second, which told me everything I needed to know. They left first, and I watched them walk down the hallway together, close but not aligned, like two people in the same photo but different stories. Daniel asked if I had seen the lock screen preview, and I told him I had. He nodded once, the way he does when something clicks into place, and he told me to write down exactly what I saw, including the time, because we would not use it theatrically, but we would use it properly if Vanessa tried to claim her family was blindsided, or if she tried to paint me as the sole aggressor. I walked out into the cold afternoon air with my folder under my arm, and I felt something settle inside me that I hadn't felt since Vanessa came back with that ring, because the room had done what rooms like that always do. It had taken a private betrayal and forced it into public shape, even if the public was only 5 adults and a box of tissues. My phone buzzed as I reached my car, and the screen lit up with a new voicemail notification from an unknown number. I sat behind the wheel without starting the engine, stared at the icon, and felt the familiar tension in my ribs, because I knew the next message would be either Vanessa trying again to provoke me, or Oliver trying to renegotiate the reality he had just watched crack. I hit play, and Oliver's voice filled the car, no longer smooth, no longer managerial. He sounded like a man who had realized he might be the side character in a story he thought he was leading, and he asked if we could talk privately because he had questions Vanessa would not answer. I stared at the windshield, listened to the last seconds of his message, and felt the shape of the next move forming in my mind, because if Oliver was asking me for truth, then Vanessa's scaffold was already shaking, and if her scaffold was shaking, then the next 30 days would decide whether she rebuilt it on my silence, or whether it collapsed under the weight of her own overlapping lies. Oliver wanted to meet the same day, which told me he was either scared of what he had bought into or desperate to keep his pride from bleeding out in public. I chose a cafe across from the courthouse, not because I needed drama, but because the location reminded people that stories eventually become records. When I arrived, he was already there, hunched over a paper cup like it could anchor him, and he looked less like a future husband and more like a man waiting for a verdict he could not control. He stood when he saw me, started to speak, and then stopped, because whatever speech he had rehearsed did not fit my face. He asked if I knew about the ring before the weekend, and I told him I knew the moment she came back, wearing it like a trophy. He flinched at that, and I could see him replaying his own memory of sliding it on her finger, probably believing he was saving her from a cruel situation, probably believing he was the main character. He told me Vanessa had said we were effectively broken up, that I had refused to let her go, and that she needed to secure her future before I cornered her into a bad deal. The way he said cornered made my jaw tighten because it was a word built to justify duplicity, and it also sounded like something Vanessa would repeat until it felt true. I kept my hands on the table and my voice level, and I asked him one simple question. When did she tell him she still lived with me? He blinked, looked down, and admitted she never said it directly. He said she described it as staying with family, or in transition, or between places, and he said he assumed that meant she had already moved out. Then he pulled out his phone and showed me a string of texts where she talked about packing, sorting things, and needing space. But the timestamps lined up with days she had been eating dinner in my kitchen and leaving her shampoo in my shower. The messages were full of soft language and hard intent, and he looked genuinely sick as he scrolled, as if each line had been written to gently steal his dignity. He asked why I moved her belongings out while she was gone, and I told him I did it because she used surprise as a weapon and I refused to stay in the line of fire. I told him I did it because I wanted the first clean boundary on the record, not the last messy apology in the hallway. He tried to argue that she deserved time, that things were complicated, and then he stopped mid-sentence because he finally understood the problem. Complication was her chosen climate, not an accident of weather. He asked what I wanted from him, and I told him I wanted nothing from him except the truth, delivered once, while he still had enough self-respect to tell it. He hesitated, then admitted something that made my stomach go cold. He said Vanessa had asked him to sign a short statement for her attorney, something about how she felt unsafe and how he had supported her through separation, and he said she wanted it dated in a way that made it look like the engagement happened after she moved out. He said he refused to sign because the dates felt wrong and because he had started to sense he was being used as furniture in a staged room. He said she got angry in a quiet way, then switched to tears, then threatened to cancel the wedding if he did not back her up. And that was the moment he realized he might be marrying the same manipulation I had been living with. I asked him to forward me the request for the statement, including the time it was sent, and he did, right there, hands shaking slightly as he hit send. I watched the email land in my inbox, and I felt the line between private humiliation and legal consequence sharpen into something clean. Daniel had already submitted our evidence, but this would tighten the noose around her credibility because it showed intent, not just overlap. Oliver asked if that meant he was going to be dragged into court, and I told him only if he kept choosing her story over his own eyes. When we stood to leave, he looked like he wanted to apologize, but he did not know what he was apologizing for, and I did not give him an easy script. I simply said the next hearing would not be about who felt what, because Vanessa had tried that in mediation and the room had stayed unmoved. The next hearing would be about what she claimed, what she filed, and what the record proved, and if she tried to argue anyway, she would be arguing with empty air. The morning of the hearing arrived with the kind of calm that only exists when chaos has already been scheduled. I wore the same suit I had worn to my first promotion meeting years ago, not because I believed in lucky clothes, but because I believed in signals, and I wanted the room to see a man who came prepared, not a man who came to beg. Daniel met me outside the courthouse entrance with a thin folder in his hand, and that quiet expression lawyers get when they already know how a story ends, but still have to watch people perform the middle. He did not hype me up, and he did not reassure me with slogans, because he knew the evidence did not need comfort, it needed space. Vanessa arrived 10 minutes late, walking fast and smiling too wide, and she carried herself like she could out-talk gravity. She glanced at me once, then looked away as if refusing eye contact could erase a timeline. Her attorney tried to greet Daniel with forced warmth, the kind that says they hoped we would settle and keep the damage private. Daniel returned the greeting with polite emptiness, and that was when I realized the real battle had already happened, just not in the room she planned to dominate. The paperwork was done, the exhibits were labeled, the ledger was signed, and the story had been anchored to dates that did not care about her tone. Inside, the air smelled like printer ink and old carpet, and the clerk called our case with a voice that made every situation sound identical, which was the point. Vanessa started first, and she launched into what she thought was the winning angle, which was always the same with her, She described herself as trapped, misunderstood, and financially endangered. She claimed she needed exclusive access to certain assets immediately, and she framed it as basic fairness, as if I had been hoarding oxygen. She talked about her transition, her safety, her support network, and I watched her try to build a new world in front of people who lived in the real one. Then Daniel stood, and he did not raise his voice or change his posture, because this was not a fight, it was a presentation. He walked the judge through the timeline with short, direct sentences, and he used the court's own language against her, which meant he did not need to call her a liar. He only needed to show the contradictions. He introduced the evidence already submitted, and he referenced the exhibit numbers like they were coordinates, because that is what they were. Her claims about when she moved out collapsed against shared utility records and the dated inventory from the move-out crew. Her claims about her financial hardship collapsed against the documented spending pattern tied to her own card during the exact weeks she described as survival mode. Her claims about being isolated collapsed against photos and public posts that placed her at events she said she did not attend. Vanessa interrupted twice, trying to correct details out loud, but each correction made her worse because she kept arguing facts that were already locked into the record. Her attorney tried to rein her in, but she could not help it, because control was her reflex, and losing it in a courtroom felt like suffocation. When the judge asked her to address one specific date, Vanessa answered with a story, not an explanation, and Daniel calmly pointed to the document that made the story impossible. The judge did not look angry, and that was the terrifying part, because anger would have meant engagement, but this was just dismissal. By the time the judge spoke, the outcome sounded almost boring, which was the most satisfying justice I had ever witnessed. The requests Vanessa pushed were denied or narrowed, and the temporary terms shifted toward stability and documented behavior, not dramatic declarations. The judge warned her plainly about filings that misrepresented facts, and the warning hung in the air like a closed door. Vanessa turned toward me with a face that asked for reaction, for fuel, for something she could carry home and reshape into a new accusation. I did not give her anything, because that was the last lesson she had refused to learn. I stood, nodded once to Daniel, and walked out while she kept arguing with empty air, and the sound of her voice faded behind me like a radio finally turned off.